So Poland Japanese Garden is a 100% American 501c3 certified organization in Portland, Oregon. The garden was first opened to the general public in 1967 to provide the people of all backgrounds with a garden of great beauty and serenity, while forging a sort of healing connection to Japan on the heels of World War II. It was through conversations among a group of civic leaders who sought to offer a personal encounter with Japanese culture and tranquil experience that celebrates the natural beauty of Oregon in the Pacific Northwest. Some 60 years later, the garden has now become known as the most authentic Japanese garden outside of Japan, and also a global destination for Japanese art and culture, attracting close to 500,000 people from across the world annually. In this sense, we see the Japanese garden as a holistic art form that encapsulates all traditional art forms and cultural practices of Japan, including architecture, performing arts, and even contemporary art forms. We also take huge pride in being one of the very few places outside of Japan that one can come and learn firsthand the art of authentic Japanese garden making, as well as maintenance. And that is what our International Japanese Garden Training Center was created for. I say this again, International Japanese Garden Training Center. I know this is a really long name for a center. We need to very quickly come up with an acronym for this. But International Japanese Garden Training Center, as the very first of its kind actually in North America, working directly with a host of Japanese landscape architects, scholars, and gardeners and philosophers alike to craft all English language programs for all levels of practitioners. I hope one day you will have a chance to experience it for yourself. With this, I'm just going to gradually delve into the main part of the discussion today by welcoming you all to the program, taking the time, especially when the whole country probably is still processing today's historic event in Washington, D.C. earlier today. For those of you who have just joined the program, I'm Aki Nakanishi, Arlen Shunitsa Curator of Culture, Art, and Education. And I'm just simply humbled and excited all at the same time to be the MC for this virtual session today, inviting some of the most revered and thought-provoking scholars within the field of landscape architecture, cultural landscape, and of course, cultural archaeology, as they relate to garden making in general, and more specifically, Japanese garden making. So this is the second of the three-part panel discussion that is associated with the main art exhibition currently taking place at the garden. I now see the slides for International Japanese Garden Training Center. And these are some of the images that, that were taken during some of our very, very typical hands-on programs. This is actually fun to see, to relive some of the moments back in the old days, right? I mean, when people were able to come together and talk face to face. I really do miss those times, actually. Hopefully, we're going to go back to some sense of normalcy in coming months with a new administration of vaccination. Yeah, like I said, this is the second of a three-part discussion series. The first one already took place in December, last month, December 18th, actually. It was called Bridging the Past and Future. It took place on precisely December 18th, inviting some of the most acclaimed public intellectuals from the Japanese American community. And it is now archived for your viewing. And link to the archived footage is actually included in the reminder email that you all received. So the art exhibition Healing Nature explores the gardens and art at Manzanar, which is one of the 10 American concentration camps that incarcerated approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry 2/3 of whom were actually American citizens by birth. We're just going through the actual exhibition view. Thank you, Kanako. By the way, Kanako is a wonderful webinar operator behind the scenes. So these photographic works are actually by Ansel Adams, Dorothea Lane, and Toyo Miyatake. And they reveal the resilience, perseverance, and resourcefulness of Japanese American internees at Manzanar and, of course, other camps. The three artists had very distinctly different perspectives coming into the camps at different times. Dorothea Lane went to the camp actually she was on federal government's commission. Ansel Adams went there out of curiosity and friendship with the facility director. And Toyo Miyatake was actually imprisoned there and smuggled a camera lens into the facility to start documenting life behind barbed wire. Kanako, I think we're going to come back to one of the slides that you already shown. Anyway, the three had very different approaches to the subject matters. Thank you for being so prescient, Kanako. So we decided to do this to do this exhibition mostly because this year actually marks the 75th anniversary since the end of World War II, and Poland Japanese Garden had dedicated this year to global peace, going back to our very core values of peace and mutual understanding for nature and culture that I talked about a few minutes ago, actually. And we thought we must do this exhibition no matter what, when we stumbled upon the fact that at one point, there were more than 100 Japanese gardens created by the internees in Manzanar, California. We also excuse me, we also knew that all of the 10 camps, all of them, of course, were built on very desolate grounds, but gardens of some sort created by the imprisoned communities. And perhaps one of the most, if not the most famous Japanese garden ever created in concentration camps is the one photographed here by Ansel Adams. And yes, those artists were already well established and prominent in their own right. But we kept asking this simple question to ourselves. Why do people create gardens even beyond simple subsistence and beautification? And of course, today's session also addresses questions like, is it universal that people of any backgrounds tend to make gardens under the harshest of circumstances across the world? Or what collective memories can archaeologists unearth in the ruins of those former garden sites? So now, just before bringing on the distinguished speakers today, I'd like to briefly turn our attention to our biggest collaborator for our program, the Oregon Historical Society. We're just so honored to have participation by the Director of Community Engagement, Ms. Eliza Canty-Jones, to say a few words here. So Eliza, thank you so much for taking the time to come to our program today.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. I was finding myself looking at some of these slides, finding myself taking a deep breath and just taking a moment to enjoy the beauty and to breathe. And so feeling some of that healing nature right now. And I'm so grateful to Portland Japanese Gardens for many things, perhaps most of all choosing to schedule this program, or reschedule, I should say, for today, a day that's filled with so much emotion here in the United States and perhaps in other places of the world as well. The mission of the Oregon Historical Society is to preserve our state's history and make it accessible to everyone in ways that advance knowledge and inspire curiosity about all the people, places, and events that have shaped Oregon. And we have been doing this work in the state since 1898. We have a research library, amazing online digital resources, a journal, the Oregon Historical Quarterly, we've published since 1900, museum exhibitions downtown, online, and in traveling shows that can go out across the state, and educational programs working with teachers and students, now virtually, but also in our museum and in workshops across the state. But one of the best ways that we're able to accomplish our work is through partnerships with other individuals and community leaders. And so I had the pleasure of meeting with Kanako some time ago. She came and talked to me about the work that the Portland Japanese Garden was doing and asked about ways that we might partner. And it was such a generous invitation. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity for us to know about this work and to help spread the word about what you're doing. You know, really advancing knowledge and inspiring curiosity about Oregon's history can happen in so many different ways. And so for us, the pleasure in the Portland Japanese Garden taking on this series and creating this to help us all engage in learning and understanding about history in ways that are relevant to our lives is such a joy for us to see. And we're grateful for that leadership and the opportunity to participate. At OHS, we have a vision that we foster a better tomorrow through an Oregon story that is meaningful to all Oregonians. And I think the work that we're here to take in today is a great example of ways that we can shape an Oregon story that's meaningful to all of us. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. And thank you very much for the work that you're doing, Portland Japanese Garden. We're honored and proud to be your partner.
Thank you. I'm gonna put myself back on. Thank you very much, Eliza, for walking us through the critical work that the Oregon Historical Society does for all of us in the community and beyond. Just such an honor to have you as the program partner. So I hope there will be many more opportunities for us to collaborate down the road. So Eliza, please do feel free to stay on for the rest of the program as part of the audience. Well, just one more minute, 1 minute before I proceed to bring the distinguished panelists of the day. Just a quick housekeeping note from me. This program is recorded for later sharing and viewing, and there will be a Q&A session towards the end of the program. So I would encourage you to post any questions you might have for our panelists using the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. Without further ado, I'd like to begin introducing our panel members. He's the author of the monumental book entitled Defiant Gardens that takes you on a journey of garden making for humanity as a means of communal and personal expression. The book has become such a staple in landscape architects' bookshelves as the go-to publication, as we benefit from the wealth of knowledge whenever we think of gardens as cultural landscapes. He's the Philip H. Knight Professor of Landscape Architecture at University of Oregon Emeritus. Professor Kenneth Helphand, it's so nice to have you here today. We'll be addressing you as Ken for simplicity and intimacy throughout the session, if we may. Excellent. Hi. Joining us from the University of Denver, Colorado, as archaeologist, she's been devoting much of her academic research to cultural artifacts as they relate to collective memories and cultural identity. Her latest book, Finding Solace in the Soil, reveals an amazing breadth and depth of research findings and interpretations at one of the 10 internment camps for the people of Japanese ancestry during wartime. We are very fortunate to have you join us. Professor Bonnie Clark, we'll be addressing you as Bonnie, if we may. Last but not least, of course, a trusted colleague with a lifelong experience in everything to do with Japanese garden. Now having completed the colossal garden facility expansion project, along with world-class architect Kengo Kuma, he truly has added a critical dimension to our notion of what a Japanese garden is. Sada Uchiyama just assumed a new title as the garden chief curator and will be moderating today's conversation. Sada, sorry to keep you waiting. The session is all yours.
Yes, thank you, Aki. And I'm truly honored and humble to have this distinguished the guest. And it's just that today is again very special days in Washington, D.C. And here we are at the Portland Japanese Garden. We are examining the one part of our history, but for the same purpose, for the peace in the future. So today is a very special day in that sense as well. And so first, I'd like to actually have Ken have a short presentation, but just a couple of remarks. This is much more personal from my experience as a Japanese gardener, and also I am sort of self-proclaimed the cultural geographer. So that's my background in University of Illinois. That's really one particular essay really actually changed my life. That is the Beholding Eye by Donald Meinig, right down the mid-1970s, I believe. So that's really changed my view of the Japanese garden. I was trained back in Japan, yet just building the garden, I didn't think about or talk about the garden much, but just building the garden. But through that essays, really I start to see the Japanese garden in totally different light. So the garden can be seen as a different sort of versions, like nature's history, place, and aesthetics, all of those things. Yet the topic we were talking today is the most important aspect, and the very reason why garden, in particular, a Japanese garden exists. So my motto is everyone needs a Japanese garden. So I'm hoping to find the part of the answer to this by statement and in both presentation and conversation afterward. So with this, I'd like to change the podium to Ken.
Okay, 1 second. Perfect. Is that working? Good. Thank you, Sada. It's a pleasure to be speaking this afternoon after this morning's inauguration of President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. There's an affinity between that event and today's talk about gardens in the internment camps. For in a dark time, both represent hope for the future. When Sada first talked to us about this program, he posed for us the question of what brought us to this topic. So I will start there. I'm a landscape architect and a landscape historian. I've taught the history and theory of landscape architecture for 45 years at the University of Oregon, and I have a particular interest in exposing my students to garden theory historically and asking a central question of what gardens mean to people. Interviewed by the poet Siegfried Sassoon during World War I, Winston Churchill said, "War is the normal occupation of man." And then he qualified his answer saying, "War and gardening." I was inspired in my research by a single photograph of a garden built behind the trenches in the First World War by French soldiers, and decided to investigate 4 examples from wars in the 20th century. Not home or victory gardens, but the gardens that were part of war itself. The fact that gardens existed in these situations is remarkable, even inspiring. They were gardens in the First World War built behind the lines of the Western Front, gardens built in the Warsaw and other ghettos under the Nazis during World War II, gardens created by prisoners of war in both wars, and gardens constructed by Japanese Americans interned in this country during the Second World War. I called all of these gardens defiant gardens, which culminated in the book, Defiant Gardens Making in Wartime. What are defiant gardens? What are they? What do they have in common? Defiant gardens are gardens created in extreme or difficult environmental, social, cultural, economic, or cultural conditions or situations. They represent acts of adaptation to challenging circumstance, but they can also be viewed from other dimensions as sites of assertion and affirmation. As we'll see, this is dramatically true for the gardens created by Japanese Americans. Gardens are always defined by their context. Perhaps the more difficult the context, the deeper the meaning. Defiance can also be versus extreme environmental conditions. In the internment camps were intentionally located in remote sites in the American West and the swamps of Arkansas, sites of intense summer heat, freezing cold, windy, dust-blown places, intentionally located distant from communities. There were 10 camps. Okay. I assume everyone watching is familiar with the infamous February 19th, 1942 Executive Order 9066, signed by President Franklin Roosevelt, that directed 120,000 Japanese Americans living in a newly demarcated exclusion zone, which included all of Western Washington, Oregon, and California, along with Southern Arizona. People were given only 6 days to 3 weeks to put their affairs in order, and then they were relocated to undisclosed locations away from their homes and communities. This population included 17,000 children under 10. Before people were relocated, they were placed in temporary locations. One south of San Francisco was the Tanforan Assembly Center, a racetrack. People were housed, which is really an inappropriate term, in stables, but they immediately began to transform their environment. Minnie Akuba, who was a graduate student in fine arts at Berkeley at the time, was interned there, where she recorded her experiences that were later published in a book. There was a standard camp layout that combined elements of military bases, prisons, and farm workers' housing. The internees were given an empty space, an empty frame, to an open space structure, which they then proceeded to modify to their specifications. Within that framework they received, the internees created complete open spaces and incredible gardens. It's important to note that before the war, Japanese Americans on the West Coast were the mainstay of the Japanese gardening and maintenance industry. And there were many farmers and nursery owners. Their level of skill and knowledge was enormous. However, they'd never been confronted with the desert and swamp environments that they were now forced to live. But their ingenuity and imagination, using whatever materials was available and gathered, was amazing. In the camp, they created gardens everywhere. They were at the entry to barracks, at mess halls, such as you see here, in fire breaks, and community parks and recreational fields, and canals and irrigation ditches that were diverted and created to create swimming pools. There were large communal victory gardens and agricultural enterprises of orchards and fields. Eventually, beyond the fences, materials beyond the fences were brought into the community, like you see here, this painting by Chiro Obata from the Topaz Camp in Utah. The most elaborate gardens were built in the hospital and the camp's parks. Here's the hospital garden at Manzanar as it remains and as it was originally. And at Manzanar, as you've heard already, the site most photographed by visitors, such as Ansel Adams, Dorothea Lange, and the camp photographer Toyo Miyatake, was Merritt Park, also called originally Pleasure Park. And the three photographers, as was mentioned, are featured in the exhibit now on display. It was designed by the Nishi brothers, who you see there in the photograph. And this is Joyce Akuzaki in her photo by Ansel Adams with her mother and sister in the garden tea house. She was 9 years old when that picture was originally taken. At Minidoka, outside of the Torai Gate that marks a so-called wildlife preserve, a Mistanita bonsai'd the sagebrush, making a wild place into a garden, but also making it Japanese. These gardens were all short-lived, but their brief duration is not at all proportional to their meaning. In fact, their brief lifespan may accentuate their significance. Let me suggest that the meaning of these defiant gardens could be summed up in 5 deceptively simple ideas: life, home, hope, work, and beauty. And each had its manifestations in the internment camp gardens. Life. As a living being, we have a natural affinity for the natural world and its life forms of animals and plants. This is biophilia. The products of the gardens help us sustain us biologically with food and also psychological sustenance. In Shinto belief, there are spirits, kami, that are found in places and natural elements. In time, the spirit of ancestors was said to reside within those places, and stones were the favorite vessels for their residence. It's easy to think of the stones of the camp gardens as the embodiment of the spirit of those who lived and left their imprint on the landscape of the camps in the 1940s. Home. We have deep attachments to the places we call home. Gardens may be part of our home or reminders of homes we've inhabited. The internees were dispossessed people, really internal refugees in their own country, and they were now thrust on their own resources. These displaced persons inherited a landscape that they transformed. It was a courageous and assertive action. Garden making in the camps was a domestication of an inhospitable environment. This was home, but of an indeterminate occupancy. And internees worked to create a cultural setting that fostered a semblance of normalcy under abnormal and unjust conditions. Evacuees took what was an empty and vacant canvas and made it into their home, the domestic environment where personal and family life was enacted. Garden making was a way of taking possession through labor, design, creativity, use, and cultural signification. For people who'd just been dispossessed, this was particularly important. Work. Garden is a verb as well as a noun. There's an inseparable bind between the action and the place. Gardens in the camps offer the dignity of work, opportunities for an expression of individual creativity and a shared cultural identity. The Japanese American community was used to hard work. Keeping active, busy was a way of maintaining self-respect and pride in one's work and individual identity. In prison in Poston, Mr. Inoue said, "But we were Japanese after all, so no one spent lazy days." Work takes more than effort. The Buddhist priest at the service of the 2001 Manzanar pilgrimage paid homage to the creative ingenuity of camp inmates to create a semblance of normal life. The children you see here in the elementary school garden are at the Amachi camp in Granada, Colorado, that Bonnie will in fact talk about next. Beauty. Gardens are beautiful. Gardens are an outlet for creative impulses as well as a form of artistry. Perhaps the recognition of beauty and the human desire to create things in places of beauty is accentuated by ugly conditions. The gardens were beautiful, but also an expression of anti-institutionalization. In a dehumanized setting, garden making helped humanize the camps. The camps were strange environments, and the creation of a garden could make them more familiar. Hope. Gardens grow. They take time to conceive, make, and develop. Hope is wishful, but it is an assertive, affirmative act that takes us to the garden as an expression of cultural identity, as an act of resistance. The gardens can offer an assertion, a voice for the voiceless, involvement for the disenfranchised. The garden can act as an escape, or it can be thought of as a form of counterattack. It can be a line of defense. It can be aggressive. As Scottish artist and garden designer Ian Hamilton Finlay has noted, he said, certain gardens are described as retreats when they are really attacks. All of the camp gardens, grand and small, were acts of resistance directed toward the maintenance of cultural identity and self-respect. They were tangible symbols of hope that helped people survive their internment. One can think of the gardens as the anti-camp, a subversive response to internment, where individual and collective gestures were a way of denying the camp administration and environment. Gardening can be a heroic act. These were heroic gardens. The National Park Service has excavated many gardens now at Manzanar, but a walk through the former camp originally showed signs that there were gardens everywhere. Well, what survived? Originally, an arraignment of stones, upraised rock, rusting tin cans. These shards of internment experience were poignant signs of the lives of those who struggled to continue the lives and maintain their dignity and culture. I was struck by the entry walks, a line of stones, a slab of concrete leading to a barracks now gone, the welcome mat linking the dirt street and the barracks, the place that was home for several years. Since 1969, there's been an annual pilgrimage to Manzanar. There have been similar pilgrimages to other camps by the survivors, their families, and others in solidarity with the experience. Garden making was a way of asserting Japanese heritage. Jean Wakatsuki Houston, author of Farewell to Manzanar, and she was there as a young child, thought that the rock gardens would outlive the barracks, the roads, and towers of Manzanar, and the camp's enduring legacy would be its stone gardens that had been made into, she said, something enduringly human, for each stone was a mouth speaking for a family, for some man who had beautified his doorstep. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. Just that it's really resonate me, and these are my father's generation. He was a gardener as well. Of course, he was in Japan, but it just it really touches my heart, and just thinking about the garden in that environment, and why garden and why then. So it's really the fascinating and the very moving. Also, just listening his presentation, just I cannot think of the sort of there was the 8th shogun of Muromachi period, way back, basically the mid 15th century in Japan. So he's said to be the father of the all those well-known Japanese cultures and art practices, like such as tea, garden, and poem, and all those things. So his shogunate was just about under attack, and Kyoto was under fire by rebellions. And what he was doing then, he was in the garden, and he was making the tea and reading the poem and appreciating the art. So it's just easy to say, he just retreated and just ran away from his responsibility. But I can really see the parallel. I mean, the why even the shogun is the most powerful on earth in Japan back then was just out of, I think, helpless in a way. But somehow he retreated and then surrounded and sit in the garden. But that's the beginning of actually many of those Japanese cultures. So that's really fascinating how this energy and sort of intensity actually bring something anew. So it's very interesting. Thank you very much for wonderful presentation. So we'll talk more a little bit later. So now I'd like to turn the microphone to Bonnie. And again, she same thing. It's dug really deep into the one particular location in Amache in Colorado. So I'd like to hear her story, and then we'll talk more about findings from both of your research. Bonnie.
Thank you very much. I so much appreciate that. Ken set the stage very well for me to kind of jump in and talk about one particular camp and one particular approach, which is through doing historical archaeology. So the picture that you see here is of the WRA, or the War Relocation Authority, confinement camp in Colorado, which in 2006 became a National Historic Landmark, which is a designation reserved for sites of the highest import in the United States. It's officially called Grenada for the adjacent town, but it's best known by its postal designation, which is Amache. The landmark designation calls out the widespread presence on site of incarcerate created landscaping features like the one you see here, especially gardens, as a key element of its significance to the nation's history. And so in the year leading up to its designation, I became aware of the site's high physical integrity through an archaeological reconnaissance survey that was actually paid for by a community organization made up primarily of Amache survivors. So as a historical archaeologist, the chance to work at a site where there was so much community concern was something that I couldn't resist. The fact that there were gardens here was something that, as a home gardener myself, I understood these to be really resonant and important places. I'm also a professor, and I teach at a university in Colorado. And so the site provided a really unique opportunity for training students through a research project that would contribute to knowledge about a really important heritage site in our state. So like all archaeologists, I study the material evidence of past behavior, which is often revealed through systematic landscape survey, but also through excavation. And mostly folks associate archaeology with deep time, but it's also a viable way to study more recent human activities, especially those with shadowed histories like internment. The chance to work with the people who studied at the site you study is pretty rare for an archaeologist. And the support of the community, like I said, was a really important factor for my wanting to be there. And puzzling out those finds at Amachi with those who have a personal or family experience of camp, like Carling Tanagoshi Tinker, who's been a volunteer with me for 5 field seasons. Creates an amazing synergy around the research. Archaeologists working during historic periods, we also weave in records like photographs, maps, and written documents. This document from a government report helps us understand the demography of Amachi, which at its height held nearly 8,000 people. It was the smallest of the 10 WRA camps, but it was still the 10th largest city in Colorado during the war. The 3 main population areas that ended up at Amachi, which are highlighted on this map, were all from California. And over half of the residents of those areas were in horticultural related professions. Many of those who came from the Central Valley were farmers, including residents of 3 farming colonies in Merced County. Those from the northern coast were often involved in poultry raising or seasonally harvesting crops. The LA population came from a neighborhood of mixed professions, including landscape gardeners. And it was also the home to a number of truck farms, produce stands, and backyard nurseries. Before ever going into the field, I reached out to camp survivors, their families, and the town of Grenada, which owns the site. I wanted to make sure that archaeology would be a welcome intervention, and also built on the knowledge that both communities hold about their past. And those consultations not only suggested that our work would be welcome, they also yielded stories of life during World War II and significant historic documents. I like to think of this as the community archive that people have held on in their families since the war. And these materials greatly enrich our work. When I traveled to Los Angeles to visit survivors there, a number of people insisted that I meet Jack Murrow. As a young man, Jack felt a mission to document what was happening at Amachi. And so, like Toyo Miyatake at Manzanar, he managed to sneak in a camera. In fact, in his case, he mail ordered a camera in. He dug a dark room underneath his barrack, and then he made an enlarger out of a coffee can. And when I first visited him in LA, he kindly shared with me many photographs, a number of which document this really beautiful town hall garden that was adjacent to his barrack. An Amachi survivor and Japanese American National Museum volunteer, Gary Ono, who has also been a volunteer on my project, is working with Jack to digitize his negatives and prints. And if you are interested in Jack's photos, given that we're here to accompany a photographic exhibition, you can access them through the website that's up on the screen. Something that photographs document and survivors vividly remember is, as Ken pointed out, just how desolate Amachi was when they arrived. The camp is on the high plains of Colorado near the Kansas border. It is a windy and semi-arid region that was actually just coming out of the Dust Bowl. And the sandy native soil is really only good for growing hardy plants like the yucca that's featured in this artwork that was created by the Amachi Silkscreen Shop. But not even the native vegetation was growing when incarcerees arrived because the central camp area was bulldozed for construction. So what you have is a creation of a sort of a windblown nightmare by the removal of all of what of the native vegetation right before people showed up. After several years of consultations, we held our first archaeology field school at the site in the Associated Museum in 2008. That was the first of what has been 6 field seasons, where we've learned about Amachi through community engaged landscape archaeology. One of our most time-intensive but revealing work has been systematically surveying the site to identify and document the remains that we can see on the surface of gardens and other landscaping features. From the outset of the project, I was really interested in how Amachians were taking that expertise in growing things they had before they showed up, as well as values and aesthetics, and how they were applying them to this entirely new environment of the high plains of Colorado. I also was really interested in what the landscaping and garden features could reveal about connections and strategies inside and outside of the camp in a situation of both upheaval and shortage. We've discovered many ways that Amachi incarcerees radically transformed the Stark camp landscape, basically turning what had started out as a scraped down prison into a town. Our survey results revealed just how common, but also how variable the landscaping and gardens of Amachi are. The site has many examples of the 3 types of gardens that are often found at other WRA camps and that Ken showed many pictures of. Entryway gardens that flank the doorways of barracks, ornamental gardens or parks in public spaces, and also vegetable or victory gardens, some that are in front of barracks, but others that are sort of more like community gardens that are located on the edge of blocks. Excavations reveal really important details about how these gardens were constructed and what was grown in them. Information we recover through systematic soil sampling for seeds, for pollen, and for other botanical remains. That was how we discovered that this garden that you see in the process of being excavated employed transplanted native plants. And that's something that we find in many Amachi gardens. And there's and Ken showed that wonderful picture of a similar process happening as trees and cacti were being imported in to other camps. The design of this garden is very symmetrical, which is something that is not usually associated with Japanese gardens, but it's perhaps reflective of the work experience of the many former LA area professional gardeners who lived in this block. And it's also, I think, a good reminder that, as garden historian Kendall Brown has noted in his work, that these are Japanese American gardens. Excavation revealed that the walls of these garden beds were made of cinder blocks that had been very carefully split into 4 pieces. A few whole examples remain around the site, but as used in the garden, they were very deliberately cut and shaped. And as modified, they look like a fairly passable mock basalt, which would be a garden, typical garden material for a Japanese garden. And this is, I think, a really good example of the ingenuity of Amachi's garden designers and how they transformed institutional materials in their gardens. Other excavated gardens have employed much more traditional Japanese garden techniques, such as miniaturized landscapes of mountains, like the one that you see on the top, or of an islandscape, like you see down below. Although, again, using improvised materials. In this case, the concrete pieces are byproducts of camp construction, and they were used in the place that in another garden might have used large stones. The garden on the left yielded very few plant remains, either seeds or pollen, and was likely mostly a Kara Sensui dry garden. And you might be able to still see a little bit of the gravel. There was quite a bit of gravel from the nearby Arkansas River that was in that garden. Well, the garden on the right was just jammed with flowering plants and scented plants, and is similar to those that you would find in a tea garden, complete with a path that meandered around a central feature. One way that we've assessed the horticultural expertise exhibited in the Amachi gardens is through intensively testing the soil chemistry against off-site controls and non-garden areas. And the chemical analyses indicate that in almost every garden strata, there are more useful nutrients and often more balanced pH than in the surrounding soil. Some amendments we have encountered include eggshell, fish remains, even iron slag from the blacksmith shop. And despite the short duration of the occupation and the quickly draining sandy sediments, there remains 70 years later a legacy of care for the soil in a place that no one chose to live. Geological sourcing has allowed us to identify that many of the garden stones were transplanted from Amachi to Amachi from both nearby but outside the barbed wire, and from as far away as the foothills of the Rockies. These are a tangible reminder that the camp was far more porous than most imagine, with people getting work permits and leaving temporarily on work, or for group activities like Boy Scout camps and even Bible camp. It appears that on these forays away from camp, striking natural stones were a prized find brought back to beautify their camp setting. The results of our pollen analysis has been truly surprising. We find evidence of all kinds of plants that would be very difficult to grow on the high plains, like dogwood, cattail, and this one, canna, which is a tropical plant that's a relative of ginger. Our first evidence of canna came not from an entryway or an ornamental garden, but actually from a vegetable garden. It grew alongside potatoes and is evidence that the victory gardens at Amachi themselves were also beautiful and held a mixture of culinary and ornamental plants. The Amachi Gardens were a way to transform an unfamiliar and institutional environment into one that was more productive and pleasurable. But the intense investment in these gardens suggests something deeper at play. And in here I echo Ken's point. Japanese garden philosophy, as reflected in this quote by the first designer of a Zen Buddhist temple garden, combined with my research on horticultural therapy, suggests that gardening was a practice uniquely suited to help people of Japanese ancestry cope with the stresses of being confined. And in taking care of their gardens, they also took care of each other and of themselves. The picture that comes from the gardens at Amachi is that of resourceful, imaginative, and skilled people. They turned an oppressive and monotonous environment into one that was useful and beautiful, sometimes through the use of objects that most of us would consider trash. When singled out because of their ancestry, they did not turn their back on their heritage, but they expressed it creatively and insistently. These gardens remain an amazing testament to the human spirit in a world where forces seemed bent on destroying it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bonnie. Again, just I'm so fascinated and just drawn into the presentation. Thank you very much. And so the garden was for individuals and the families, and then also for the community. So that's a very fascinating part. So the garden was built and for themselves, but at the same time was the communal sort of decision. And I'm sure it's a big population, and then just combining the sort of workforce or even get agreement with what to do or not to do itself is just mind-boggling to me. It's just how they, in such a confined, stressful environment. Also, it's interesting. This, you know, I'm not the archaeologist, so my digging is digging the hole for the planting the trees and things. But the interesting sort of parallel I can draw is I am 8th Japanese gardener for this Portland Japanese garden. Started back then, 1965. And so as I do some digging and the repairs and the construction, I find the old stuff there. And it's interesting that that's being the professional, you know, gardeners, and they are too. So I can pretty much tell, for instance, they're in a hurry or they didn't have the materials. They are so frustrated or something like that. So I sometimes share my sort of view of even I can tell, you know, they started construction or building the rock wall, and then the rain started and the dust, you know, nights 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. So the good work starts sort of crumbling down to sort of lousy finish. So I'm sure the Bonnie, that's the kind of things I'm sure you are finding. And also talking about the resourcefulness and ingenuity. So there's a Japanese old wisdom, the notion of mitate, M-I-T-A-T-A. Mitate is seeing things anew. So in other words, just to give all things a new life. So my father's, my parents' generation, and sort of what I call collectively sort of indigenous Japanese, they had this old sense of, you know, the farmings and the forestry. So they can read the climate, they can read the soil, they can read the animals and the vegetation. Then definitely I can tell that sort of their knowledge, I'm sure passed on to from the previous generation, really plays a big role in the garden building. Again, thank you very much. That's just a fascinating research. So I have a couple of questions to each of the speakers, but this is what, even such a short period of time, what I learned is this sort of the defiant gardens built regardless of the location of the style or sizes, just a sort of different mental states, or just a different reason to build a garden. Like one is a sort of, again, this eighth shogun of Romachi, the spiritual refuges. And then some, I'm sure, feel that more like a spiritual or psychological reconciliation, which in Japanese called shikata ga nai. So it's not the giving up, but it's just accepting and not necessarily go along, but it's something much deeper, and shikata ga nai. So it's they have to reconciliate. So by way of building the garden or manifesting some their traditions. And then, as Ken mentioned, spiritual sort of resistance in a way, sort of non-violent. So I never thought the garden being non-violent sort of way of communication, and it's. But again, in either case, strong emotion and wills are built into the gardens. Again, it's a fascinating. It's not just the ones serving themselves, but also for the communal. So that part always I can, when I see the visitors here at the Portland Japanese Garden, and think, why coming many times? And some are, monthly or weekly sometimes. So I think this gives me something to think about more. So it's time ticking. So I'd like to just start with Ken, just a few questions. So in your defiant gardens, you point out that act of garden making is inherently a part of what it means to be a human. I mean, basic of basic. As you said, the garden ranges from the subsistence to the highest form of art. The Japanese garden perhaps here is an art form, but the other end is this basic needs or human activity. So in that sense, as a Japanese garden though, did you find anything particularly unique about the ways in which Japanese Americans in camp went about creating their gardens?
Sada, thank you. You actually sent us these questions, so give me some time to think about it. And I was thinking about this one, what was unique, and I think these Japanese American gardens are part of a larger category, which I would describe as immigrant gardens. Virtually everyone in camp was either first or second generation immigrant to this country. And I think immigrant gardens have something in common. What immigrants do is they bring their home country with them and then try to adapt to their new residence where they are. And what do they bring? So they bring materials. So in the Japanese gardens, they brought particularly stones, plants, or what was here, the stones that were available, water. You bring a set of forms and patterns, what we speak of as design, and they brought a set of historical designs and their own experience of design. And they bring, importantly, a set of symbols and meaning, where they might we might look at the exact same thing, look at a rock, look at water, look at a plant, but to these individuals, those elements had a particular meaning, and they could arrange them and design them to mean certain things. And we didn't go into that, but I'm sure there's people in the audience who are very familiar with the symbolic elements. And if you visit the garden in Portland of, how stones can represent turtles and cranes and the world, et cetera, and that's there. So each of those elements that these immigrants bring would have a distinctive meaning. And in your just comments just now, I was also made a note thinking about this. All the gardens in the camps were public gardens. There was no backyard. There was nothing that was hidden. Everything that was done had a public face. There were things that were done communally in the parks and the larger gardens, but even the ones in front to an individual barracks, which were not individual because those were occupied by several families, in fact, but everything had a public face. So everything here was a communication, if you will, speaking in a language that would be, I think, understood by the people who were there. And I think that's critical.
Thank you. The word language, it's easy to understand in that analogy. Really, I think it's just a different form of the Japanese.
I think it was also noted, correct me if I'm wrong, generally, things in the camp people were not allowed to use Japanese generally in the public statements. Everything written, had to be in English and so on. So here was a possibility of essentially speaking the language. It wasn't a written or verbal language, but the gardens are a language. Gardens have a vocabulary, they have a narrative, they have a story, they have a history, just as language does.
Right. Thank you. That's very interesting. Thank you very much. The language that sounds kind of resonates me now more. And so turn to microphone to the Bonnie then. So we're talking about the really 1940 to 45, that range, just about 70, 80 years old. So there's a sort of still the people who experienced the camp and their stories, and there's I believe plenty of record. And in the meantime, you are there and digging the garden back up and finding all kinds of things. So what was, if any, unique findings could there be beyond what the former internees remembers or have a record of?
Well, I mean, something that there's actually some really wonderful archaeology done in the 1970s where they would interview families and then they would look through their trash. and even so, whether it's conscious or unconscious, we don't always are aware of everything we do. And, or sometimes we, don't want to tell that story. Or it doesn't seem important enough. And so we always learn something from people's garbage, regardless of if it was, what got dumped in the back alley a week ago, or it's 70 years ago. So it's a different type of story. It's this tangible part of evidence of activity. And for the internment camps, I think it's particularly important in a couple of different factors that I think make archaeology so powerful. One is that generation who were the gardeners, the majority of those gardeners, they're gone. And they also were the generation who didn't want to talk about camp. And so we don't know much about their strategies, about their stories. And those skills, that kind of embodied skill that you just talked about, Sada, about, sort of knowing the rain and being able to feel the soil, like those things aren't usually written down anyway. So their story is the story that we see in the soil. And so we can, again, understand their strategies and their skills that way. And we can also see what the lasting imprint is, right? So those legacies are something that we, kind of encounter archaeologically. I think the other is that, the more I do this work and I talk to people, is that, there's so many different camp stories. And so by doing this kind of archaeology where we're looking and we're comparing, we can kind of, it's almost like it's like a prism and we're putting all the little pieces together in a way that we can kind of synthesize a story that no one person knows.
Thank you. It's a very interesting and story. So Aki-san, just a quick question. So we're about 4 o'clock. I can ask a couple more questions to Ken and Bonnie. And do you get some questions from the audience?
Yeah, Sada, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent.
So,
Okay.
so let me then ask Ken one more and also Bonnie one more. Then I'm sure there's a more interesting question coming out of the audience. So I'll then turn to Aki. So,
Sure.
So Ken, I guess I skipped to the third question because I think that's kind of important. So your professional, this research, and I'm sure that's more also the personal journey, long journey across the United States and also the countries beyond, and observing how in different time of the history, people have made a place or gardens. So do you feel there are any lessons or implication that those sort of rudimentary act of garden making and the gardening have offered to the modern and contemporary planning, urban planning and the landscape architecture in general, particularly today after this, not after, we are still in the COVID sort of situation, if you have any thoughts.
But thank you, Sadi. I not only have thoughts about it, I've thought about it a great deal. I wrote something that I sent to the New York Times. Unfortunately, it didn't appear in the New York Times, but it did appear in the Eugene Register Guard. And if you bear with me, I'll read some pieces from that, which appeared in our local paper. So I'm quoting myself here. The coronavirus has fostered new and revised habits. People are baking bread, painting, learning a new instrument, reorganizing files, cleaning basements, and millions are gardening. Why? Gardens are close to home. They're easily accessible with free admission, and they're outside and a safe place to be unmasked. Gardens are places of pleasure in times of crisis or difficulty. Gardens defy our expectations. Many of us have a friend or a relative whose company we appreciate, find congenial, who in time of need responds with an unexpected aid or depth of compassion and empathy. Gardens are like that. Gardens are comfortable companions whose capacities lie dormant, awaiting a crisis to catalyze a wellspring of possibilities previously unimagined. We are not fighting a conventional war, but a disease, an invisible and insidious foe we struggle to mitigate and control, but not yet able to defeat. Gardens can offer food, and for many its produce is essential, but gardens offer other forms of sustenance. They offer us contact with the natural world and a degree of control at a time when the fear of disease and death hangs over us. Gardens are about stability, the rootedness in caring for homes. Gardens activate the positive associations of home, a place of family, friendship, and life's activities for all generations, play and enjoyment, of digging in the earth, of sitting in the sun or enjoying the coolness of shade. A garden can help us anticipate a home life when we hope the coronavirus has ended, when life can return to, if not normal, then a revised and improved condition. Perhaps as the virus upsends familial and cultural patterns, we may have a new definition of home. Gardens are about work, as I mentioned, not labor, but the pleasures of working in the garden. Gardening keeps us busy, offering the promise of a reward, a place to enjoy pleasure, or watching the production of vegetables and flowers. All gardening is an optimistic act. Gardens are beautiful, as I said. Normally measured by the seasonal cycle, garden time's been interrupted by the season of the virus, our indefinite future. Sequestered, we observe gardens closely with more care, introspection, watching plants germinate, buds become flowers, perennials reappearing, grasses going to seed, the emergence of fruit, a spider's web. We note the rich palette of colors in day-to-day changes. The size is insignificant. A potted plant can be as beautiful as a luxuriant backyard. The emotions are the same. In this pandemic, the reality of the virus has accentuated the gradual replacement of face-to-face interaction and virtual meeting place of Zoom, like we're doing right now. The realization of the direct encounter with the material world, with its full panoply of sensory richness, has become more fundamental to the human experience. The essential need is epitomized in the practice of making, nurturing, and being in the garden. We want the virus destroyed, and we want gardens to thrive. Gardens are our new friends, but friends we always had. It's taken a crisis for us to recognize and appreciate their presence in our lives. Thank you.
That's great. That makes me happy to be a gardener. Thank you.
But I think you are a very happy gardener. That's clear.
Thank you. So Bonnie, then, so the one, this, the title is very, just the title itself, your book, very self-explanatory to me. And you just brought this notion of the soil is an artifact. So basically, you just bring that sort of notion to that or particular project or research to the particular site. So the soil is an artifact. So I'm sure that's who you are and what you do. So could you elaborate on this notion and how that happened and how that affected how you went about your research at Amachi? This sort of it's a beautiful sort of description of what you do.
Well, thank you. And I have to say, I sort of owe that insight, or at least the real punch of it at Amachi, to an ecologist that I worked with, and I brought him down, and when we were talking about how I should approach and how I should plan for the work here, that's what he told me. He pointed his finger at me and he said, "Bonnie, this soil is an artifact, and you can't forget that. It tells a story just like those pierced tin cans or those pieces of ceramics." And I thought about it, and the definition of an artifact is anything that is made or modified by humans. And so if we think about soil as something, particularly again as it's amended, as it's changed, those you are doing garden archaeology, Sada, when you're scraping away and you're seeing where somebody else's planting hole was. I mean, that's the way I'm looking at this. And so in terms of thinking that, and again, an artifact is not just modified, but it's modified in specific ways that have to do with someone's cultural background, right? And so understanding what were the sets of skills that, for example, that farmers in Japan had that then they could bring and transplant with them. And when I first found fish scales and fish bones in one of these gardens, I was like, absolutely. I mean, I expected it, but I expected it because I'd read, about how much that is an important soil amendment in Japan. And so just having that, keeping that in mind, it just really made me respect and like do such intensive sort of study, and particularly to look at the soil chemistry, but also just very careful excavations to really help that soil tell its story and to understand the amazing expertise that people were applying. So if we, I think, I don't know, I'm struggling for words here, but I think hopefully I answered your question, but I don't think that we don't really normally think of soil in that way, but I think especially, I've recently been doing teaching a new class called the Anthropology of Gardening, where I'm really trying to take some of the lessons that I learned from Amachi and think about it in a broader way. And I was really pleased to read about an archaeological project that was done on a mining site where the miners had spent years amending the soil in a place that they didn't live. So they were living in worker housing. And then when they moved, they took their dirt with them because they had invested so much. And if, like here in Colorado, we have crappy, really high clay soil in the Denver basin. And I've spent 15 years in my backyard, and really that soil is not anything like it was when it started. And if I move, I think I will take it with me.
Sounds like my mom. Again, also Japanese sake brewery, they take those, the miso, for instance, like a miso paste, that's important. So I remember mom, when we moved to basically a different the region, that was only one of the few items she took. She has to have that. Sounds like it. And again, from Ken's last, just that's the article was just great. I'd like to actually read again. And then I picked the words, the garden making is optimistic act. I like that. That's positive sounds. And from the Bonnies and the soil, foreign soil or a strange place in soil is amended. So it's also the very positive tone, amended in just give the life. And again, gives also, they can sort of, I believe the people can infuse their spirit as well when they actually amend the soil. So these are my question, but thank you very much. I'm sure there's some other questions from the audience. So I'd like to just stay on the path to move forward. So Aki-san, maybe just I turn the microphone back to you.
Sure. I don't know if I'm back on actually, but you can hear me, right? Excellent. It sounds like I'm like, there in spirit kind of thing. But anyway, I'm really glad to know there's just so much enthusiasm in the virtual, auditorium, as it were. We've already received actually four in total questions from the audience. One has been already answered, and everyone can actually see it after it's been answered. First question is from Kip. Were camps populated from across the United States? I guess this could be answered by either panel members, actually. He wonders if anyone carried techniques across climate regions that resulted in new discoveries in new environments. Yeah, either Ken or Bonnie. Oh, Ken, please.
I'm not sure new discoveries, but I think what the returnees, the residents of the camps, were incredibly ingenious in using whatever was available. At a certain point, they were generally allowed outside of camp to gather materials, which was either digging up plants or stones, and using what those were. So the geology in Utah was different than California, different than Colorado, et cetera. The plant material, they were taking what was available from different places and using that. So in that sense, yes. The other is the growing season was dramatically different in places. I think Heart Mountain, the growing season was like 90 days, which is not very long. You're not going to have a lot of vegetables in that period, where in other places it was much, much longer. So there was I'd say an adaptation to the uniqueness of each of these environments. And in Arkansas, you're in this kind of very temperate environment where things were rather lush.
I guess another part of the question probably is to do with the physical locations from which Japanese Americans were rounded up, evacuated. Were all the Japanese American people evacuated to the western part of the United States, or was it just within certain parts of the United States people are taken up from?
They were, Bonnie, you can answer, yeah.
Yeah, so it's just basically along the Pacific Rim. So and down into Arizona. But the vast so like the folks who were already in Colorado didn't have to go to a camp. So there are resident Japanese populations throughout the rest of the West, but they're much smaller populations. So the vast majority of Japanese Americans live in that zone where they were removed. I do know, like, one of the things I was really struck by when I went and visited the Central Valley, where a lot of the farmers from Amachi came from, is that the soils of the Central Valley and the soils of the Arkansas Valley in Colorado are not that different, because they're both big drainages that are coming from these mountains, and it's a very sandy sediment. So in fact, there were some, even though they weren't used to the sort of the hot, high, like the wind of the high plains and some of the other environmental settings, that soil wouldn't have looked that different. And so again, I think they did have some good ideas about how to make that more productive. So yeah, again, that they knew some things, but then they also were in this new setting where they improvised and experimented and used all sorts of amazing materials.
Well, one thing I think that's noticeable when you read people's memoirs and oral histories of being in the camps, how conscious they were of the environment that they were in. The specificities of it, from as Bonnie mentioned, literally the soils, the rocks, the plants, most dramatically the weather, the kind of seasonal variation, the daily cycle. The people who entered the camps were generally either farmers or rather urban folks. You had a lot of city people placed not in cities, and they were very, very conscious of the environment that they were in, both negatively and also positively in terms of their response to being in these, what we would now might think of as these dramatic settings.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that thorough and comprehensive answer. Yeah. This one is probably for Bonnie, actually, because John asks you about, have you found evidence of other non-native plant materials besides canna in any of the gardens?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the plant materials is probably non-native. We actually have, there's one little stand of roses that are still growing. They don't blossom anymore. They haven't been pruned in a long time. But then the trees themselves, so most of the trees are, some were transplanted from the Arkansas River, some cottonwoods, but most of them are Chinese elms that were purchased from a nursery. We know that there was like a kind of that town hall park that I showed a picture of, that most of the seeds that were planted there actually came from the Sears Roebuck catalog. And we have one jar that we found of that's filled with squash seeds. And I think that they were, I suspect that they were saved, and it's clear that they were saving those seeds. And we know that, I don't have explicit record of that at Amachi, but at other sites that people talk about having brought seeds with them to camp. And so there's lots of different pathways and lots of different, non-native plants that were there. Again, some that we found from the pollen were dogwood and also cattail that were probably, the cattail may be planted in, in or near a water feature. So there is a wide variety of those. And then the things that people planted in their vegetable gardens. So in addition to squash, lots of cucumbers. There were, we've found corn pollen. So I think people are raising some corn. So it's a wide variety of crops. And if you look at the historic pictures, and there's some of those that are in my book, of the agricultural fair, which was like the county fair at Amachi, there's all sorts of pictures of just like piles and piles of vegetables, onions and celery and my favorite, an American flag made out of what appears to be like rhubarb and celery.
Excellent. Sounds like a great farmer's market, actually. Brilliant. So you already answered, Ken. That was, where can we find the article you just quoted, but you did answer this to this specific person, right?
I answered it to everybody. You can. It was on the UGC Register Guard. I don't know whether you can search it through their site, but if anybody emails me and I put my email address, I can send it to you.
Excellent. Brilliant. I love your super efficiency. Yeah, because in the interest of time, actually, in keeping with time, we just need to be mindful about the time limit we have. So, Sada, I guess I could start closing the session. Are you okay with that?
I think it just please emphasize those two books are just wonderful. I'm reading, this is the third time on Bonnie's and the second time around, and with a bunch of notes. So I really encourage everyone to read those books many times. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Sada. And any closing thoughts from both of you, actually, from the panel members, starting perhaps with Bonnie?
Just what an honor it is to be part of the programming at the Portland Japanese Garden. I've had the pleasure to visit on several occasions, and it's just it's a treasure. And so those of you who live nearby, I hope you are supporting the garden. I'm sure it is, speaking of solace, it's a good place to go. And right now, as Ken pointed out, gardens are our friends right now. And so I hope you are helping to support your local garden, and that you're also, finding solace in your own soil.
Thank you so much. And Professor Helphand?
I like Bonnie ended with actually the subtitle of her book, which I think was very good. When I'm asked to inscribe my book, I write, to people, I write "Garden with Hope and Defiance," because I think those two go together. And I think that's dramatic. And I echo the sentiment. I think the garden in Portland is an incredible cultural and community resource. And I've been a member for a long time, and I visited it for a long time, and it's been redesigned, or at least the entrance and main plaza has been redesigned in recent years by, I should add, by landscape architects from Portland who won awards for this, and it's an extraordinary place. And I recommend everyone go there. And just thank you for this opportunity to share our thoughts about gardens, and particularly gardens in the internment camps created by I describe these places as great American gardens.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Professor Helphand. I particularly like the new notion for me, just as much as Sada sang the praises for the new term that we came across. The soil really is an artifact. We really like that too. I also like your notion, Professor Helphand, of botanical beings or botanical gardens as part of our language, as part of our heritage. And to me, it sounded almost as if the garden could be some form of cryptography, in a way, speaking without the sort of spoken language. And that really was a very powerful message for all of us, actually. In keeping with time, I know we've, you've noticed that we've cut a lot of corners actually in this absolutely intriguing conversation today. This was a true tour de force of a discussion for me, for Sada, for the entire garden community. So thank you so much. And this will be one of the pivotal topics that we'll be revisiting many, many times as the public discussion around the meaning of gardens actually keep evolving. And this discussion really gave me a lot of narratives through which to ponder the human relationships with nature and community as a source of cultural identity and dignity, as well as a source of solace, like you said, and serenity, of course. This has also given us a very nice segue to the next session, this time next week, which will bring today's sort of macroscopic view of cultural landscape much, much closer to the actual location of Manzana. We'll be joined by Professor Helphand once again, along with two other Manzana specialists, Mr. Jeffrey Barton and Mr. Pat Alvarado. I'm already looking forward to the next session, but I'll do my best to really absorb and instill today's discussion. I mean, that was such a full discussion. So I'm just gonna try to absorb that. And to that end, the books that we talked about extensively throughout the program, Define Gardens by Ken and Finding Solace in the Soil by Bonnie, are both available through the links provided in the reminder email that you received, and also in the follow-up email that you'll be receiving. Those books have a highest recommendation if you haven't read them already. Before we close, I'd like to just express thanks again to our program partner, Oregon Historical Society, along with our partners and sponsors, Cambia Health Solutions, Melville Clark McDonald Fund, Oregon Cultural Trust, and Jackson Foundation, as well as those generous support from individuals such as Joe Didi Yeager, Cheryl Atchison, Kao Meho Tanabe, and of course, Kei Kitagawa and Andrew Johnson Laird. Thank you all for having faith in us through these absolutely unprecedented times. Thank you again to Ken, Bonnie, and Sada for this thought journey for all of us, and we look forward to your visit to the garden in the very near future. Thank you all so much. See you next week. Thank you.